if you want me to.
Okay, Islam, unmute my mic. Yeah. Okay, Genevieve, I will send it to you.
We're live right now, so if everyone can mute themselves.
You want to be
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's conference, Selling Death, Why the International Arms Trade Must Be Controlled. My name's Kate Hudson. I'm General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and it's my pleasure to be hosting the first part of today's conference. The second part will be hosted by Genevieve Nevin, an activist campaigner. This conference is organised jointly by the Peace and Justice Project and Egypt Watch. In our discussions today, we aim to shed light on the ongoing arms sales between Western governments and Middle Eastern countries, such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia. We'll have two main roundtable discussions, and our speakers will investigate the benefits and impacts of these arms sales on both sides. Then we'll move on to discuss how to limit these arms sales and how to make them conditional on human rights, international justice, and democracy. We have a fantastic range of expert speakers with us today. It's a pleasure to welcome them all and to welcome you, the audience, as well. Jeremy Corbyn, who is one of the hosts from the Peace and Justice Project, will be our last speaker because he's just come hot foot on the train back from a meeting in Bradford. So, Jeremy, we look forward to hearing from you later on. Arabic interpretation and sign language are also available, so visit the Peace and Justice streaming platform to access those. We'll also, towards the end of our discussion, be considering possible actions that we collectively can take to impact on the arms trade and bring about a transformation away from selling death. So without further ado, it's my privilege to welcome our first speaker, Osama Gawish. Osama is founder and editor-in-chief at Egypt Watch. He's a refugee in the UK, a well-known journalist and TV presenter in Egypt and the Middle East. He made his name as a broadcast journalist with a series of high-profile leaks of secret recordings of Sisi. He's a reporter at journalism.co.uk and hosts a daily political talk show on Al Hiwar TV. He's written for The Guardian, Newsweek, Media Diversity Institute, Hot Topics, and Middle East Monitor. Osama, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Kate. Thank you for the introduction and a warm welcome to all at our international conference, Selling Death, Why Arms Trade Must Be Controlled. I believe this is a topic of great relevance and extreme importance to everyone around the world in the current times. So thank you, honorable speakers and amazing moderator, for joining us today. And of course, a special thanks to the Peace and Justice Project and to Mr. Jeremy Corbyn for their unbelievable support in making this conference a reality. And many thanks, of course, also to our amazing organizers and all my colleagues at Egypt Watch who worked extremely hard behind the scenes to make this conference live. Egypt Watch is a media service company based in London, founded in 2019 with a vision and view that Egypt deserves better. Our mission is to put Egypt under the international spotlight and to raise global awareness on the declining situation in Egypt, and to advocate for the freedom of press, for human rights, and for the upholding democracy. We are actively working with a strong team of journalists, editors, researchers globally to report on Egyptian current affairs and to shed light on untold stories, bring you only the most credible news about Egypt. Today, we are delighted to organize this international conference in collaboration with the Peace and Justice Project to shed light on the ongoing arms deals between Western governments and Middle Eastern countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, among others. Today, into a session, as Kate said, our speakers will investigate the benefit, the impact of these arms deals for both parties. The international arms trade is extremely profitable for the global military-industrial complex. It is riddled with bribery and corruption, which has been known to be a main source of income for arms corporations. This trade is also notorious for paying no attention to human rights. This is particularly true for arms exports to Egypt and Saudi Arabia. For instance, Saudi Arabia has an appalling record on its war with Yemen. The Saudi Air Forces has been responsible for many of the 22,700 air raids and the death of over 8,500 civilians, including 2,300 children. The impact of this war on Yemen is evident, and the economy in Yemen is at its weakest. Additionally, Save the Children has estimated that about 85,000 children have died of starvation, thanks to the horrendous war. I have first-hand experience of similar events in Egypt. I was a dentist in my country. I've never thought that I would have to leave my homeland. But the reality is that I fled Egypt in 2013 after the bloody military coup. I saw with my own eyes my friends being killed by the Egyptian military regime in Rab'a massacre. I became a refugee, among others in exile. All of this happened because some Western governments sold weapons and, in extension, sold death to the Egyptian military regime. In all these years since, sadly, nothing has changed. Western governments are still selling weapons to the Middle East countries. Sales to Egypt are booming despite all the suppression. The plight of more than 60,000 political prisoners is simply ignored by the arms corporation and by their government. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Egypt was the third largest arms importer in the world after Saudi Arabia and India between the years 2016 and 2020. Today's Sisi's regime in Egypt and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman are still exploiting their citizens. They are still arresting and killing activists, and the international community is still turning a blind eye to the human rights violation in these countries. In light of these facts, with an emphasis on Saudi Arabia and Egypt, this conference will address the nature of the international weapon trades, who benefit from it, why exporting countries fail to control the consequences, and how best to campaign against these trades. One of the key lessons we learned during the pandemic is how much stronger we are when we work together. So here we are. At this conference, we will work together in an attempt to put a stop to these weapon sales that are bringing nothing but death of innocent civilians in the Middle East, and to finally to say to hold the world, enough is enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Osama. Very wise words. I know that will guide our thinking this afternoon. Our next speaker is Paul Rogers. Paul is Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. He's a biologist by original training, lecturing early on at Imperial College and also working as a senior scientific officer in government service in East Africa. For the past 40 years, he's worked on international and environmental security and has written or edited 30 books. He's International Security Advisor to Open Democracy. In the late 1990s, he wrote Losing Control, Global Security in the 21st Century, which was years, if not decades, ahead of its time, anticipating the 9/11 attacks and the 20-year war on terror that followed. A new edition has just been published, updating and expanding the analysis. It looks forward to the 2030s and 2040s as the decades that will see a showdown between a bitter, environmentally wrecked and deeply insecure world and a possible world order rooted in justice and peace. Welcome, Paul. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Katie. It's an honor to be involved here with people from right around the world. We thought it would be quite useful to talk a little bit about the nature of the arms companies before we move on to all the effects of the trade. So I'm really looking at the military industrial complexes, which tend to exist in all the major countries. It is very big business. If you were to take the world's top 5 arms companies, which happen to be all American, in terms of their revenues, the 5th has something like revenues of 30 billion US dollars a year. The leader, Lockheed, has revenues of something like 62 billion a year. So we're talking about very large groups of people, very large companies. If you take the top 20 worldwide, 8 of them are American, 7 are Chinese, 1 is joint Franco-Dutch, and then the others are British, French, Italian, and Russian. Most of them, less so the Chinese ones, are truly multinational, and they actually have links right across the world. You see it, for example, in the connections between US arms companies and the State of Israel, which has its own very considerable military-industrial complex. And you have many different connections, many different weapon systems which are developed in one country, produced in another. And that is true across many of the Western elements of the international arms trade. The key thing about these individual companies is that they work closely together and they're always part of complexes in particular countries. And arms companies are not alone in this. In fact, if you take any major arms company, it will have links with government departments, the military themselves, of course, think tanks, universities, and the rest. I've been very lucky in my career to lecture quite frequently at some of Britain's senior defence colleges, so I've seen this firsthand. So, for example, you have the well-known revolving door, and the revolving door works by a constant interchange of people between those groups. So you may well actually have an arms company which will second people to the Ministry of Defence in Britain. You may have, certainly when people retire from senior civil service roles or from the military, particularly if they're involved in weapons procurement and weapons development, they'll be assured of consultancies and perhaps, if they're senior enough, board memberships of the companies themselves. And so the whole thing is essentially linked in, and the degree of lobbying capability is really quite considerable. In fact, if you take all the different elements of human activity, it is probably the arms companies that are among the best at actually promoting themselves, because after all, almost all of them, outside of the Chinese ones, who are a rather special case, are companies which have to be profitable. They are obviously part of the entire shareholder capitalism system. There's been a great deal of consolidation of the companies in recent years, which has left few of them that are really very powerful. Other aspects of this, which I think are hugely important, are that you find that there's a kind of culture within the military-industrial complex as a whole, which tends to be state on state, and concerned with state-on-state conflict. It is really dominated by an establishment culture which, if I may use one bit of jargon, can be described as a culture which is imbued with hegemonic masculinity. It is incredibly male-orientated. And the point about this is you have it with a very particular attitude that essentially major challenges are intrinsically seen, if they are global or if they're pertaining to particular countries, as challenges which are met with global responses. That in many ways is the key to all of it. It's said within the industry that a really clever arms company succeeds in selling to both sides. It doesn't happen very often, but certainly what is very important is for an arms company to work hard to ensure that politicians and indeed the general public in a particular country can see a threat as something which affects them. It's a challenge, but beyond that, it really relates to the ability to defend yourself. And this is really very deeply in this. And you find, for example, that if there's any major regional conflict, for example, in which a particular kind of weapon system is used, very soon afterwards, you will find that in the arms journals, the arms magazines and the rest, the traditional advert of that weapon system will have stamped across it combat proven or something like that. So the whole attitude is one of looking at where the challenges are, building them up, which means briefing universities, funding universities to develop knowledge and public knowledge on these issues, and ensure that essentially the arms trade is very good for business. I won't say anything really about the corruption element. We have Andrew Feinstein, who's a world specialist on this, speaking to us later. But I'll give you an example. If you have a large arms contract in which, say, 5% is set aside for what is politely called commission, which all too often is bribery, well, 5% out of a $10 billion contract actually comes out at $500 million. So you're talking about a huge amount of money available. I'm within the last half minute of my 6 minutes.
That's right.
Let me just add one thing to finish. To put it very bluntly, and we're facing this huge problem of COVID, you can't nuke a virus. You can't use the military to control climate change. So above all that we're talking about today, we have to get used to the fact that in many ways, war as an opportunity to solve things is becoming obsolete. But within that, the arms trade and its role in the bringer of death is hugely important now and for the near-term future. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. Thank you. So our next speaker is Caroline Rose. Caroline is a senior analyst and head of the Power Vacuums program in the Human Security Unit at the New Lines Institute, where she focuses on ungoverned spaces of concern to US national security interests. Prior to joining the New Lines Institute, Caroline served as an analyst at the forecasting firm and publication Geopolitical Futures, where she worked on political, economic and defence developments in the Middle East and Europe, with a focus on the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant. She is also the author of a special report on the illicit drug trade, Captagon, in Syria and Lebanon, a culmination of her work as research associate for the LSE International Drug Policy Unit's Middle East Initiative. Caroline holds an MSc in International History from the LSE and a BA from the American University's School of International Service. She tweets at @CarolineRose8. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to start off and thank Egypt Watch and the Project for Peace and Justice for hosting this excellent opportunity to discuss, debate, and learn about the implications of the international arms trade. I'd also like to thank Kate and Genevieve for moderating this discussion, as well as all of our audience members tuning in from around the world, taking some extra time this Saturday to have this crucial discussion. Now, I want to start off with the fact that we often discuss the international arms trade solely within a humanitarian framework or lens. But today I want to add an additional layer to this, which is the geopolitical and prolonged implications of the international arms trade and how a lack of regulation and knowledge about this trade poses long-term risks to human security across the globe, particularly in the Middle East. So the intensification of arms trades not only impedes a country's development, but they also embolden authoritarian behaviors, intensify existing armed conflict, and very notably lower the threshold for intrastate and interstate disputes. This instability in turn is a wrecking ball to social and economic progress, state governance, and introduces new power vacuums that threaten our collective interests abroad. The Center for Global Development conducted a recent and very useful assessment on the arms trade that identified the arms trade as a likely factor in undermining not only human security, but also economic development. Every year, prolonged armed conflict degrades local and national economies and socioeconomic development while discouraging outside investment and undercutting international aid. The Middle East in particular has been a perfect case study of how the consequential effects of the international arms trades affects human security. Imported arms have fueled militarized authoritarian governments, lowering the threshold for armed conflict and elevating threats to human security, shrinking economies, promoting crime and instability, and illicit markets. In a study called The Buildup of Coercive Capacities, by Olivia Pam, Lucas Rudolph, Paul Turner, Andreas Methretter, and Simon Primus for the Journal of Peace and Research, the authors identified that weapon inflows do not only factor in prolonging conflicts, but they also increase the probability of inducing a conflict as states anticipate violence, acting as an initiator instead of an effective deterrent. And the resulting picture is amounted to considerable power vacuums in Yemen, Syria, Libya, Iraq, with a robust illicit arms trade among competing non-state actors and terrorist organizations through the diversion and misuse of weapons. And on a geopolitical level, the region's arms importers have built a sound and robust bloc that counters effective arms trade reform and measures that are in the interest of national sovereignty. When approaching arms control, I think it's important to factor in the appropriate level of risk calculation, particularly when dealing with conflict-prone countries that tend to inhibit more militaristic, authoritarian, and low-income factors. While the US, Russia, China, France, and South Korea were the top arms exporters in the world over the past few years, it is important to take account additionally how arms export volume measures against economic size and the continual risk factors of both arms exporters and importers. Fortunately, there are a lot of helpful indexes published by think tanks and a number of other institutions that implement useful metrics such as neighborhood risk scores, average consumer and customer risk scores, conflict-prone conditions, authoritarian rule, economic development that can reveal whether high-risk zones are intensifying, and they allow arms exporters to assess potential clients with riskier portfolios. Research institutes vary in what they deem as the greatest risk factor and different customers as well. In a 2020 study, Cato listed Syria, followed by South Sudan, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Somalia as the riskiest arms recipients, with the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, Syria, and Cuba being the arms importers with the greatest growing risk factor since 2018. And in a study of arms import and export risks, the Center for Global Development ranked Libya as the top arms customer with the greatest conflict risk, with Saudi Arabia, Syria, Oman, and Yemen following respectively. Yet while we've witnessed political willingness among various members of the international community to implement measures for arms trade reform, the system is simply not working. The issue is not necessarily a lack of treaties or agreements, but an issue of enforcement. Not only have a number of signatories for the Arms Trade Treaty, the ATT, not ratified the treaty, but a notable number of signatories of the ATT are failing to report arms exports under licenses, meet the minimum requirements for disaggregation, pay their submissions to the treaty on time, and meet the agreement's basic transparency requirements for arms financial value, type of weapons, and transit and destination countries.
1 minute.
Of course. And then another issue is, of course, buy-in. Some of the notable arms importers and exporters, such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, have not yet necessarily signed some of these agreements, or they've revoked their signature of these treaties. And so despite the supporting infrastructure that the ATT and other agreements have created, with a lot of different projects providing training and licensing support, the treaties cannot work without adequate buy-in from arms exporters and importers. So I want to also talk quickly about issue management as a primary mechanism. Reform, re-export, retransfer controls, bilateral, multilateral discussions, and greater measures countering the illicit underground arms trade are going to be necessary for governments seeking to protect livelihoods, long-term stability, and human security. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed. That was very, very interesting indeed. It's a shame we don't have a lot longer to discuss these important questions. So to move to our next speaker, Sharif Mansour. Sharif is an Egyptian-American democracy and human rights activist. Before joining the Committee to Protect Journalists, he worked with Freedom House in Washington, D.C., where he managed advocacy training for activists from the Middle East and North Africa. In 2010, he co-founded the Egyptian Association for Change, a Washington-based non-profit group that mobilizes Egyptians in the US to support democracy and human rights in Europe. Welcome, Sharif.
Thank you very much for having me today. Osama especially, who provided the invitation, and Egypt Watch for co-organizing. It's important to talk about Egypt, my home country, because both Osama and I are exiled. I haven't been back since 2013 as well. Both separately forced out because of our work for human rights. And this is the aspect that I wanted to talk about today. It's the quiet war that goes every day across the Middle East, where the governments actually use violence against their own population to build the fear barrier, to stop them from ever dreaming to be free like they did 10 years ago in the Arab Spring. A lot of that happens also enabled by Western capitals through the soft arm trade, the software trade, the surveillance industry that are provided by Western capital, the training for it provided by and supported by even Israel in the Middle East for a lot of the Arab monarchs and dictators to subjugate their own population, to suppress and censor news and coverage. Egypt and Saudi were named as one of the countries who imported most arms, but they're also recently have been one of the countries who saw the most spike in number of death penalties after China. Right now in Egypt, at least 12 Muslim Brotherhood leaders are facing execution, imminent execution, because of the event that Osama mentioned that he was covering in 2013. These are the kind of things that I think we need to highlight a lot more in the discussion, that this is in many ways a case of aiding and abetting by Western capitals who, regardless of what happens, even at the worst possible human rights violations, where we saw the most aggressive reaction in the counter-revolution since the Arab Spring. 1 of every 3 journalists who died in the last 10 years died in the Middle East, covering Arab Spring uprising that turned into civil war, mainly because of the military industry that feeds on this conflict, and also the quiet war that have been waged to build back the fear barrier and censor online and exile voices like myself and Osama. We hope that this gets more attention in terms of sanctions targeted against those who target human rights defenders, who use the military-grade arms who come to Western capital to beg for toys, their best inventions, their best surveillance software, and go back to use them against their own population without any accountability. I want to stop here. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thanks very much indeed, Sharif. And there will be time for further questions and comments later. So our final speaker in this first session of the conference is Abdullah Al-Auda. He is the Research Director for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at Dawn. He is visiting adjunct professor at the Elliott School at George Washington University and a fellow at Yaqeen Islamic Institute. He's published extensively on Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf and appears regularly in the media as a commentator. Welcome, Abdullah.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for this conference, Osama. Thank you to Egypt Watch for organizing this and for all co-organizers. So actually, my intervention here is to show how the arms sales to my country, Saudi Arabia, has been all along linked to human rights violations, and how these arms sales provided by Western governments and Western quote-unquote allies actually helped and facilitated human rights violations, wars, and destabilizing the region, in the Middle East generally. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest arms sales importer ever. From 2015 to 2016, it actually peaked, and then the 5 years, and this peak actually during that time witnessed the beginning of the war in Yemen. The imports of major arms increased by 130% compared with the previous 5 years before that. Despite the wide-ranging concerns in the US and the United Kingdom about Saudi Arabia's military intervention in Yemen, both Washington and London continued their support and continued to export arms to Saudi Arabia from 2015 to 2019 during the Yemen war. A total of 73% of Saudi's arms imports came from the US and 13% from the UK. So you see here that these are the major democratic countries that are calling for democracy, for stabilizing the region, for protecting the interests of the people, for supporting democratic values. Nonetheless, you see these arms sales to most brutal authoritarian regimes and dictatorships in the Middle East. In the 5 years before the war of Yemen, U.S. arms and transfers and U.S. arms transfers to Saudi Arabia continued to $3 billion between 2015 and 2020. However, the U.S. agreed to sell over 64 billion worth of weapons to Riyadh, averaging like 10 billion per year. So you see the increase here, and let's see whether these increases actually reflected any progress in the human rights records in Saudi Arabia. The peak of these increases was in 2018 when the Saudi Crown Prince met with the US President at that time, Trump, and they agreed to the largest arms sales ever to Saudi Arabia, which is the largest importer of these arms sales in the world generally. And that was in March 2018. Few months after that, Khashoggi was killed at the consulate in Istanbul because the Saudi Crown Prince felt emboldened, felt that the US is backing him, and felt that he is protected, and therefore he is not, constrained by any basic democratic means. He is not constrained by any checks and balances within the system. He is not constrained by any rules. And what's sad is what happened after the Khashoggi. Even after the Biden allowed the report, the ODNI report, to be published, the Saudi Crown Prince continue to rule in Saudi Arabia unchecked. He is still not sanctioned in the international stage. He is not punished for the crimes that he has done in Yemen or to Khashoggi or to other activists. Also, like 2 months after these the largest arms sales to Saudi Arabia in 2018, Loujain al-Hudlul was sexually harassed, electrocuted in jail, and tortured. My father was tortured in jail around the same time. My family and 19 members of my family were banned from traveling around the same time because the Saudi Crown Prince felt emboldened. And I'm giving these examples and personal examples to show how these arms sales actually facilitated and emboldened these dictators to not just continue their human rights violations, but actually to take them to another level.
1 minute.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to end here, but I'm just going to say one thing, that most of these democratic countries will always use this conditionality to say that we're going to condition these arms sales to this and that, or to protect our strategic interests. But this never worked, because what strategic interest has ever, being protected by allowing Saudi Arabia to go to war in Yemen, or to cut ties with Canada over a tweet, or to put a prime minister of Lebanon under house arrest, or to sexually harass Loujain al-Hudlul, or torture my father, or kill Jamal Khashoggi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Abdullah, for those words. We've now reached the end of the first panel for this conference. We have just a few moments before we turn to Geneviève Nevin for the second session. Please do, audience, keep your questions and comments coming in the comments feed, and we will be addressing those towards the end of the conference. But before we break briefly, I'd like to invite Stephen Bell from the Stop the War Coalition to make a short contribution. Stephen, over to you. I'm hoping the tech people will sort this out. Is he coming up now?
Maybe we can reverse the order that we are planning to do in this break, while we figure out how to get a contribution from Stop the War Coalition. I just wanted to take this time to highlight some of the amazing work that our speakers and people who will speak after us have already been doing. Okay. So if people who are tuning in today want to check out the shadowwarsinvestigations.org. That's https://shadowworldinvestigations.org. We also have EgyptWatch.net, who's one of the, of course, sponsors of this event, and as well as the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, among many other engagements and projects that our speakers have been involved in, that we will encourage you to check out, and we will also post under the comments of this live stream. But I also wanted to take this time now, because this event, which has been fantastic so far, we've heard from so many amazing speakers. This has been a free event with people tuning in from around the world, and we're only able to do more of these events and do more work like this in the future, thanks to the generous contributions from sustainers around the world for the Peace and Justice Project, and as well as with Egypt Watch. So I wanted to take the time now, and you'll see in the bottom of the link of this screen, the link to donate to two of these amazing organizations. And if people today could go to thecorbynproject.com/donate and make a contribution of £10, £25, £50, anything that you're able to contribute. This is an international project that relies on the support of donors like you from around the world to do these types of projects, because we want to build a movement to be able to fight back against all that we've been hearing today so far. You can also check out the amazing work of Egypt Watch by going to egyptwatch.net, and you can make a contribution on the Egypt Watch website as well. So if you can join me in making a contribution today, that would allow us to do more of these events in the future and keep building a movement to fight back against this deadly arms trade. So I'm not sure now if we are able to get our contribution from Stop the War Coalition on the screen here, but if that is possible to do so, if our lovely tech people could fade that person in to make this contribution. Otherwise, we can go on to our other amazing speaker for the second half, and also be able to hear from her as well. So I'll leave it to Stop the War Coalition to make this contribution. Otherwise, we will move to our next speakers. All right, so I think we'll be maybe able to hear from Stop the War Coalition later in this program, but I have the great pleasure now to introduce Bianca Mujenyi, who is an activist, author, and journalist based in Montreal, Canada. She currently directs the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which informs about the country's diplomatic aid, intelligence, and military policies abroad. Bianca is also the former co-executive director of the LEAP and helped launch the LEAP Manifesto in 2015, a vision for a just transition away from fossil fuels. She is also the former campaigns and programming coordinator for Concordia University's Center for Gender Advocacy, and you can follow more of her work by going to www.foreignpolicy.ca. So over to you, Bianca.
Thank you so much, Geneviève. Many thanks to the organizers. It is such a privilege to come together with others from around the world to expose and oppose the arms trade. So as Geneviève said, I work at the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which seeks to bridge the gap between the perception and reality of Canada's policies abroad. And despite its reputation as a peacekeeping nation, last year, Canadian weapons exports reached a record high of $3.7 billion. And this doesn't include Canada's largest customer, which is always the US. Canada is the 17th largest arms exporter in the world. Again, this does not include its sales to the US. And it was also the second largest exporter to the Middle East in 2017. Last year, Canada sold weapons to dozens of countries around the world. And these are weapons that fuel conflicts across the globe. Canadian weapon sales to Turkey, Israel, Colombia have received some attention recently, but the most high-profile deal is Canada's $14 billion light armored vehicle sale to Saudi Arabia. And in addition to LAVs, Canada has also sold sniper rifles and other weaponry to the Saudi government. And Canadian weapons have been used against Saudi civilians as well as Saudi forces in Yemen. As we all know, the scale of Yemen's suffering is unimaginable. And Canada is unfortunately among the foreign governments that have sustained the conflict by supplying fresh weapons that have been used to fight a devastating war that's displaced millions, contributed to the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. There's simply no excuse for arming the Saudi monarchy. So a few months ago, CTV News, our news channel here in Canada, reported on Canada's lax weapons export regulations. And activists were quoted saying that, open quote, less than 1% of export permits for military goods were denied in 2020. It's almost a perfect approval rating. This despite many export destinations being routinely being the site of serious human rights abuses, they said. Our government is breaking their own rules. Canada has restrictions on the books. They've signed the arms trade treaty, but acceding to this treaty seems to have meant little. It's important also to get one thing clear. It's not just private companies selling arms to foreign governments. The state apparatus is advancing it. The Crown Corporation, specifically facilitating arms deals, is called the Canadian Commercial Corporation, or CCC, and they grease the wheels of the arms industry. The LAV sale to the Saudi government, for instance, is a contract between the Canadian Commercial Corporation and Saudi Arabia. So we're seeing deep support for the weapons industry from the federal government through trade commissioner support, contractual support, and other public support for weapons. So it's much more than passive acceptance of weapons sales. A quick look at the Department of National Defense's website reveals many different forms of support to arms exporters. And one section of the website reads, open quote, learn how the Department of National Defense can assist in connecting Canadian industry to foreign markets. And one way that it markets its military goods is through defense attachés. And these are based in 30 diplomatic posts around the world where they promote military exports. Additionally, representatives of DND often talk up Canadian military equipment as part of delegations to international arms fairs like the Abu Dhabi-based IDEX conference. And even the Canadian military is used to sell arms. Canadian officers attend international arms fairs, and the Canadian Navy sometimes visits ports during international arms exhibits, which is a type of show sort of designed to spur arms sales. So one aspect of this promotion of weapons is the massive annual arms fair in Ottawa. And for more than 2 decades, the annual Canadian Association of Defense Security Industries, CADSI, has been running the CanSec Bazaar. And this brings together representatives of armed companies, the Department of National Defense, Canadian Forces, various other arms of the federal government, and dozens of foreign governments. And this 2-day bazaar is attended by more than 10,000 people, including MPs, the defense ministers, senators, and many generals and admirals. And throughout the rest of the year, beyond this conference, Canada's arms industry lobby non-stop. And regardless of where production takes place, all the major arms companies have offices within blocks of Parliament Hill. They hire recently retired generals into senior corporate positions. And representing 900 corporations, CADSI is the primary industry lobby group. And they've got 24 staff and focus on industry-wide political concerns. And they were concerned about whether the new government follow in the same militarist path. And so they launched an aggressive lobbying campaign aimed at the Liberals in 2016. And in their report, they described their work as, open quote, an intense engagement plan that included hundreds of engagements with key decision makers, half of which were members of parliament, key ministers, and their staffs, including the Prime Minister's office. From one-on-one meetings to roundtables to parliamentary committee appearances to our first ever reception on Parliament Hill, we took every opportunity to ensure the government understood our industries and heard our message. So the war machine is immense, but there is also resistance to it. And activists succeeded in having the CanSec conference banned from city property for many decades. There's been lots of pressure within Canada's peace movement to stop arming Saudi Arabia, from open letters to protests to longshoremen refusing to cross picket lines set up by peace activists seeking to block a shipment of armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia. Exporting these arms truly is a disgraceful priority of Canada's government, and activists are rightly calling on the Canadian government to immediately cancel the Saudi arms deal. And more generally, when it comes to weapons sales, the Canadian government should stop providing trade commissioner support, end contractual support, and other support for weapons sales. We need to challenge militarism, and more so than ever before, if we're serious about achieving real global security, we have to embrace the spirit of internationalism. Without it, we can't come together to overcome the overlapping global crises that we face, and militarism runs counter to the spirit of internationalism. So, after Canada, thank you, Geneviève. After Canada lost its second consecutive UN Security Council bid, our institute released a call for a fundamental reassessment of Canadian foreign policy. And one of the 10 questions that we asked was, should Canada continue to offer financial diplomatic support to arms exporters, or we focus on demilitarization? And the answer is clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing speech, Bianca. And now I'm happy to announce that we have a contribution from Stop the War Coalition. So if we're able to move to them, that would be great.
Hello, and I'd like to thank Egypt Watch and the Peace and Justice Project for inviting us to contribute. My contribution, I want to focus on what the UN has called the worst, since 2018, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, that is Yemen, where 80% of the population require humanitarian assistance and 16 million people are facing crisis levels of food insecurity this year. The responsibility for this catastrophe lies entirely with the action of four governments, the Saudi and Emirati regimes who have organized the war and invasion, along with a siege of the country, supported and sustained by the United States and UK governments. Those governments claim that they are in some manner involved in a humanitarian intervention. The US boasts of having given $3.4 billion in humanitarian aid since 2015, while the British government boasts of having given £1 billion in the same period. Yet the United States government has sold $64.1 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia, while the British government has sold between 22 and 26 billion pounds of arms to Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis. In other words, they have given 20 times more arms to these countries than they have given aid to Yemen. Indeed, these countries are actually cutting aid to Yemen. Last year, Trump cut aid altogether, whilst the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were responsible, according to the UN, for the majority of the cut in the loss of aid budgets in Yemen. And of course, the British government this year is reducing its aid to Yemen as well. These two governments, Britain and the United States, are supporting dictatorships in Saudi Arabia and the Arab Emirates. The only people with a sustained and serious experience of democracy and civil participation is the Yemeni people. And for such a radical position, they have suffered invasion and a serious siege. We believe in Stop the War that there is no military solution, that there must be an end to the siege, an end to arms sales, and an end to interference in the future of the people, or in the future of Yemen, which the people of Yemen themselves must decide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen Bell from Stop the War Coalition. And it is a great privilege to introduce our next speaker. Andrew Feinstein is a former ANC Member of Parliament from South Africa, where he served under Nelson Mandela. He resigned when his committee's investigation into a hugely corrupt arms deal was stopped by the ruling party. Andrew is the author of After the Party, Corruption and the ANC in South Africa's Uncertain Future, and The Shadow War, Inside the Global Arms Trade, which has also been made into an award-winning documentary film. Andrew is the executive director of Shadow World Investigations based in London. The organization investigates the global arms trade and reveals the corruption, death, and destruction and immiseration it causes. The floor is yours, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Genevieve, and thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation. It's a great honor to speak on a platform with such extraordinary people from all over the world, and especially to be able to speak with those voices from the Middle East. The global trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. Politicians, their political parties, corporate executives and their companies, military and intelligence leaders, and a range of intermediaries, including arms dealers, the world's biggest banks, global law firms, auditing firms, and other consultancy services, all benefit materially from the trade in weapons. It is therefore absolutely crucial to understand, besides the geopolitical motives for conflict, the economic and corrupt motives as well. We have just heard from Stop the War and from other contributors about the devastating conflict in Yemen, a conflict in which the Saudi and UAE-led coalition is intentionally targeting civilians using the tens of billions of arms provided to it by the UK, the US, and a variety of European countries. Let us also not forget that the UK prides itself on having engaged Saudi forces in training them specifically in targeting. The reality is that in all the arms deals between so-called Western powers and Saudi Arabia that I have investigated since the end of World War II, not one excludes corruption. And this includes the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, an arms deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia in which £6 billion, that's billion with a B, of bribes were paid. And not only to senior members of the royal family who use arms deals like this to move money from the state treasury into private offshore accounts around the world, but also to the son of the British Prime Minister at the time, to the executive chairman of the big British arms company BAE Systems, and many others. Because the corruption takes place not only in the buying country, but also through what is termed the feedback principle in the selling country as well. In Israel, it is weapons, again, from the United States, from the United Kingdom and the European Union that enables and facilitates the brutal, illegal occupation of Palestine. The United States of America provides Israel with $4 billion a year, specifically for the research and development of joint weapons systems. The United Kingdom has provided Israel with over £400 million of weapons since 2015 alone. British and American military have provided training and undertake joint exercises with the Israeli Defense Forces. Israel, as Paul Rogers mentioned earlier, acts as a shop window for particularly American weapons sales around the world. And it does this in arms fairs where, as Paul said, it describes the ways in which its armaments have been used to kill innocent civilians in the occupied territories in every single incursion. It's also worth remembering that an Israeli prime minister served jail time for corruption in an arms transaction, that the recently departed Benjamin Netanyahu has been investigated for corruption in at least 3 arms deals, including 2 with Germany. And, as my former boss Nelson Mandela said after he was released from 27 years in prison, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Finally, let me turn for a moment to Egypt. The brutal, repressive regime of President Mubarak was sustained in power by over $24 billion of arms sales from the United States alone, and many more from the United Kingdom and the European Union. On average, 20 to 30% of those contract prices were used as bribes for Mubarak, his political inner circle, for the military, and the repressive intelligence networks in Egypt. Arms sales to the Sisi regime have far exceeded those sold to Mubarak. The human rights abuses, the repression of protest in Egypt is taking place with the complicity of Western governments. The reality is that this trade, which operates in secrecy with virtual legal impunity, that enriches not only brutal authoritarian dictators, that enables and extends conflict, that also enriches our own political leaders and their political parties, if we allow it to continue as it currently does. The trade in weapons will continue to make the world a more corrupt place, a more unequal place, a less democratic place, a more brutal, and most ironic of all, a far less safe place. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. And just a reminder, if those tuning in around the world would like to make a contribution to the Peace and Justice Project, you can do that at thecorbynproject.com/donate, or go to egyptwatch.net to check out all of the publications from Egypt Watch. I'm now honored to introduce a video contribution from Olduz around the explosive weapons in populated areas. So over to this video contribution.
I first want to thank you for attending today's conference, despite knowing that it's probably a very difficult schedule during the pandemic. Since the beginning of this year until May, at least 5,534 civilians have been reported to either been killed or injured as a result of the use of explosive weapons. A fight that is in control of those who produce, trade, and use these weapons. We have to continue to ask important questions like why and how on earth is this happening? Last year, I joined civil society to assist with certain communication activities around weapon technologies, military practices, and policies that are taking place. And what I learned was shocking. So today I'm going to share with you one of the messages that I've learned, and it's a very devastating one. 9/10. 9 out of 10 persons who are either killed or injured when explosive weapons are used in populated areas such as towns and cities are civilians. With 90% casualty rate being civilians, we have to continue to scrutinize these military practices that are taking place. Despite the pandemic, they've been used in populated areas such as Gaza, Nagorno-Karabakh, the Tigray region, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and so on. According to Action on Armed Violence, almost 29,000 incidents have been recorded across 123 states and territories just in the past decade. Now, that's a global problem. We have to highlight that these weapons do not just cause direct harm. They cause long-lasting psychosocial, economic devastations. And when actors of armed conflicts use these weapons and practices, the ones who pay for these are primarily children. According to a UN report, we saw in 2020 alone over 26,000 grave violations recorded, and that includes bombed hospitals, schools, homes, markets, children being killed and maimed, abducted and raped. This is just one of the many price tags that comes with war. I'm Olduz Arabi. I'm a journalist currently working on a film that focuses on the civilian harm from explosive weapons. And as part of this film, I'm following the political declaration on explosive weapons that is led by Ireland. And this is one that I feel is very important for the world to keep their eyes on, so that perhaps we can live in a safer world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that video contribution. And just a reminder, if you have questions for our honorable speakers at the end, you can put them in the chat. And those questions, we will have a chance to ask all of our speakers the questions at the end. And again, if you want to find more of this work, you can check out thecorbynproject.com and egyptwatch.net. And now I have the great pleasure to announce our other speaker, Richard Bergen, who is a British Labour Member of Parliament politician who has been the Member of Parliament for Leeds East since 2015. Mr. Bergen served as the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice and the Shadow Lord Chancellor in the Shadow Cabinet of Jeremy Corbyn from 2016 to 2020. It's my great pleasure to announce Richard Bergen.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all participants in this important conference today. It's been useful to listen to all the contributions about Egypt, about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and about other countries around the world, and of course, in particular about the role of the UK and the US in the arms trade. I've been asked specifically to speak on a recent bill I brought to the British Parliament, a private bill called the Israel Arms Trade Prohibition Bill. The reason that I brought this bill to add Israel to the list of countries that the British government can't grant arms sales to, approval for arms sales to, is because I think we've really come beyond the point where British politicians offering words of regret or condemnation for what's going on in relation to Israel and Palestine. That really needs to end, and we need to have action from the British government. So our role as British activists, as British parliamentarians, should be to put pressure on the government, because the British government continues to authorise arms sales to Israel, despite clear evidence that the weapons of the types authorised for sale have been used in violation of international law. So this means that the UK is providing material support for Israel's illegal use of force. Now, the British government, of course, claims that arms export controls are tough, but admits to not knowing whether arms sold to Israel are used to break international law. However, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court determined that enough evidence had been gathered to initiate an investigation into war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories, including the targeting of civilians, extensive destruction of property, and forcible displacement. So we must call upon the British government to end British complicity in Israel's persecution of the Palestinian people. And I just want to run through a few examples of use of arms made in Britain. So, for example, F-35 warplanes made using British parts, they were used in Israel's latest war on Gaza. Arms manufacturer Lockheed Martin says dozens of the warplanes' key components are British made. And that military assault killed over 230 Palestinians, over a quarter of them children, left thousands more injured, and displaced over 90,000 people. And since 2015, the British government has licensed over £400 million of arms sales to Israel, including over £100 million on aircraft and drones, £20 million on bombs, grenades and missiles, over £4 million on armoured vehicles, and nearly £3 million on small arms and ammunition. Now, this wouldn't have been the first time that weapons and components made in the UK have been deployed in bombing campaigns in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, because when one looks back to the bombardment of Gaza back in 2014, a review by the government identified 12 licenses for, and I quote, components which could be part of equipment used by the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza, including for military radar, combat aircraft and tanks. Now, back then, the British government said it would suspend some of its arms exports to Israel if hostilities resume in Gaza. Despite this, arms sales and sales continued. And it was back in 2009 that the then Foreign Secretary David Miliband said that UK exported components were, and I quote, almost certainly used in Israeli military attacks on the Gaza Strip, leading to the suspension of several export licenses. So now is the time to act. And that's why on the 7th of July, I presented in our Parliament this bill. The bill was presented with cross-party support. Since I presented it, I've also put down an early day motion, which is expressly attached to the bill, welcoming the introduction of the Israel Arms Trade Prohibition Bill. And the last time I looked, which was last night, 28 members of Parliament from 6 different political parties had signed up through this early day motion to back the private bill I brought, the Israel Arms Trade Prohibition Bill. I've been working with the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and War on Want on this bill and their lawyers. And I know that these organisations and others will be encouraging their supporters to lobby MPs to sign up to the early day motion to show support for the Israel Arms Trade Prohibition Bill. Now, what would this bill do? This bill would prohibit the government from authorising arms sales to Israel. It would prohibit the government from authorising arms imports from Israel. And this goes to a point that Andrew raised earlier. It's important because these weapons are often marketed as having been tested on the Palestinian people. And this bill that I presented to Parliament would also establish an inquiry into the ultimate use of weapons that have been authorised for sale to Israel, which campaigners warn the government currently chooses to turn a blind eye to. So there's cross-party support for this bill. I believe support for the bill can grow with campaigns lobbying their MPs to support the bill. And it's time for action from the British government. Many people were shocked in Parliament after the recent bombardment of Gaza. They were shocked that the British government didn't even do the usual of verbally regretting or verbally condemning the actions of the Israeli government, really. They instead defended it and started talking about Hamas instead. Now, of course, Hamas isn't the subject because the British government doesn't sell arms to Hamas. And if they did, we would be telling them not to, but they don't. You know, the British government is complicit in Israel's war on the Palestinian people. The British government is complicit in the oppression of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government. So I think it's more than overdue that we bring this bill. We must get as much support for it as possible. It's been carefully drafted. And I think the fact it's got cross-party support, as I mentioned, from 6 MPs from 6 different political parties, show that really more and more people, not only around the world and in Britain, but in the British Parliament, are thinking that the continued violations of international law, the continued oppression of the Palestinian people can't go on. And our particular duty in the British Parliament is to call upon our government to stop being complicit in it, is to call upon our government to stop facilitating it. And this, of course, is part of a far wider discussion, which I'm pleased to be part of today. I and others voted to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia when you look at the brutal war they visited upon the people of Yemen. Also, people will be well aware of the historic British role in relation to the Colombian state, where trade unionists and others are brutalized, murdered and disappeared by state forces there and linked paramilitaries as well. So I'm pleased to have brought the Israel Arms Trade Prohibition Bill in this wider context. And I think today's meeting, which I'm proud to have been part of, is a key step in raising awareness of the issue of arms sales and our government's role in them, and also looking at the effects. And I think it's very interesting earlier when we heard of the fact that the arms sales don't only empower authoritarian and other governments to wreak death, destruction and misery, they also encourage it as well. And I'm pleased to be part of this event, and we need to build now a movement against the arms trade, seeking death, destruction and misery in Yemen, in Palestine and around the world in the pursuit of profit. So I'm pleased to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Richard. And that really important bill, will be able to find out how you can learn more to support that bill afterwards. And now I'm pleased to announce that we can move on to questions and contributions from and for our lovely speakers. So I will read out questions directed at individual speakers, and if those speakers could reply in about a minute, we'll be able to get to enough of those questions. So my first question is for Andrew Feinstein, and the question is, in the mindset of the UK, if we don't sell arms to the Saudis, someone else will. Surely the end game should be ending the conflict as opposed to trying to stop the arms sales. And then there's a follow-up comment there about the defense industry and how we can turn it into a peace industry. So over to you, Andrew, for that question.
Thank you very much. Two very quick points in response. If we don't, others will. The reality of the way in which militaries are established and maintained makes that unfeasible. So, for instance, if the US and the UK stopped selling weaponry to Saudi Arabia, its conflict in Yemen would at least come to an extended pause. Why? Because the reality is that Saudi military forces have been based on primarily American, British, and to some extent European jet fighters, the ordnance, the bombs and missiles that are used from them, tanks, etc., etc. And if the British or the American were to stop supplying spare parts, were to stop maintaining these jet fighters, were to stop providing the ordnance that is dropped on innocent Yemeni civilians from these jet fighters, the Saudis couldn't simply utilize completely different ordnance or manufacture the spare parts themselves. It would take them a significant amount of time to rebuild their military infrastructure. So the reality is that this argument that we see all the time is actually a practical nonsense. In terms of the conversion of military industries to more peaceful industries, there is a great deal of work that has been done that shows, for instance, that defense industries are incredibly poor job creators, do not have many linkage effects to other parts of the economy, and are therefore a very poor way to try and engender economic and job growth. In my own country, South Africa, we spent $10 billion on weapons soon after we became a democracy. It actually had a negative impact on the country's GDP. So profound was the drawing of resources. There are many important studies that have been done on this. I would refer people, because I just don't have the time to go into it now, to a wide variety of work that is done by CND, by Stop the War, by Campaign Against the Arms Trade, and many others on this topic. And also another book that we produced called Indefensible, 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. And I'll put a free link to that book in the chat so that people can access it.
Thank you so much, Andrew. My next question is for Sharif, and the question is, Sisi's regime has built his own legitimacy via the ongoing arms trade with Western governments like France, Italy, the US, and the regime keeps violating human rights without any questions or condemnations from Western governments. So how can we put pressure on both the Egyptian regime and Western governments?
Well, we as civil society leaders, people who work in human rights community, can only mobilize in many ways to pressure people who are making decisions on sanctions. In the United States, the Biden administration have said they are going to condition aid, and now they seem to be backtracking. There is a lot of pressure now should be exerted through Congress to make sure that any military aid to Egypt or to military aid or sales to Saudi is conditioned that these are will abide by the Leahy law, which says that the government cannot be involved in gross human rights violations. Targeted sanctions like the Khashoggi bans, banning visitations, bank accounts, and Magnitsky sanctions and others can also be tools, not just in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. And thanks to the sacrifice of Khashoggi and others in exiles, we now have even more leverage to make sure that those predators of human rights and violators of press freedom can face some accountability, at least in Western capitals.
Thank you so much. And my next question is for Abdullah, but before we move to Abdullah, I just want to highlight that if you go to projectindefensible.org, you can receive that free link that Andrew Feinstein was talking about earlier. And just another reminder to the speakers to keep the answers short so we can move to as many questions as possible. But this question is to Abdullah. After the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, the international community was extremely angry at MBS. However, recently the UK signed a huge arms deal with Saudi Arabia. So how do you think these Western governments are practically building political hypocrisy regarding their values of democracy, justice, and human rights?
Well, I think what happens is, Trump sums it all up by showing the world that the relationship between the Western countries and Saudi Arabia is purely transactional. It's all about money, arms sales. It's not about human rights, not about democracy, not about keeping peace or stabilizing the region. And all what is called strategic interest is these arms sales and transfers. The idea here is that Khashoggi, the Khashoggi event shed light on Yemen and in some other violations, and that should have been used to stop all kinds of arms sales to these dictatorships, not because these sales actually facilitated human rights violations and atrocities, which they are, but also because they never served any real strategic interest for these Western countries as well.
Thank you so much. And then my question now is to Caroline. A lot of people in the Middle East were optimistic with President Biden's administration. However, the reality was upsetting. The US keeps doing arms sales with Egypt, doesn't make the 1.3 billion arms aid to Egypt conditional to human rights and democracy. So how do you explain this?
Yes, the February 2021 sale, I think, was a surprise to many, just given the Biden administration's human rights record and the principles that this administration is trying to achieve in terms of protecting human rights and human dignity. And so the $197 million sale of missiles to Egypt, just days after the Biden administration took office, and also days after the Egyptian government detained family members of a US-based Egyptian-American human rights activist. I think that this was a surprise to all. But I think that this is reflective of a larger issue, and it's the fact that the Biden administration has quite a bit of work cut out for it in respect to the arms trade. So for a bit of background, the Trump administration removed the US signature to the Arms Trade Treaty, a pact that sets global standards for the international trade of conventional weapons. The announcement itself didn't necessarily change much, just given that the Obama administration signed the treaty in 2013, but there was some resistance in the Senate, and the Senate never voted to approve it. So the United States has a lot of work ahead of it, and I think it's going to be a long road in trying to galvanize political support to sign and ratify this treaty. I think the Biden administration should make this certainly a priority, and this, of course, can guide its arms policy with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with a number of other arms importers that it is engaged with, particularly with the Trump administration. But I think we've got a few years ahead, and I think that the administration, I'm a bit optimistic that hopefully they will make this a priority, and also recalculate the risk portfolio with Egypt, certainly because with Egypt, it is definitely conflict prone. They're using these arms to enact human rights violations, and the United States should be cognizant of this. This is absolutely divergent to what the Biden administration wants.
Thank you so much. And now we have an excellent question to Bianca about Canada, which is also very near and dear to my heart. Does the Canadian government stand for its values, or it's all of its interests when it comes to arms trade with Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia? So over to you, Bianca.
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, I think there's a lot of mythology around Canada's role as a peacekeeping nation. And the Canadian military has a real self-interest in military exports because it sustains the Canadian military. And they're making a lot of money. So, you know, it needs companies that are producing these weapons and exports that are tied to this. And, you know, when we look at a place like the US, it's even more concrete. With Canadian arms being sort of completely integrated with the US. You can't even quantify it because they're so integrated into the Canadian military. But when it comes to these weapon sales and the question at hand around, you know, selling to Saudi Arabia, for instance, it's more than profits. Canada sells to its allies. And so I think these sales actually reflect the fact that Canada does see Saudi Arabia as an ally. And so the formal position that's put forward is that the official obstacle to canceling the Saudi arms deal is that the Canadian government would have to pay a big fee, but it is ideological. They don't want to stop the sale. And I think that in terms of values, we can't rely on the conscience of the government and their values. I think ultimately social movements have to hold the Canadian government and other governments accountable. That's really the only real accountability rather. So in the case of Canada, you know, it's just really important to follow the work of groups like World Beyond War, Labor Against the Arms Trade, and many, many others that are working very hard to stop public support for arms exports.
Thank you so much. And now I'll move to our last question to Richard before we are passing it over to the Honorable Jeremy Corbyn to close our conference. So this question is to Richard. What other actions can you take to put pressure on the UK government to end arms sales and stop selling death to our people in the Middle East?
Well, I think in relation to my bill, but more generally in relation to arms sales to Saudi Arabia as well, for example, obviously people contacting their MPs as they always do, protests, which are always important, getting your MP to back my Israel arms trade prohibition bill. But I think there's a duty on all of us to try and keep public awareness high on these issues, because when the bombing of Gaza stops, for example, inevitably, it leaves the forefront of many people's minds in this country. But when the bombing stops, the oppression doesn't stop. So now is the time to push for arms sales to Israel to be stopped. And in the same way, when people aren't necessarily exposed to the brutality of the war on Yemen on a day-to-day basis in this country, it's very easy for the role of Saudi Arabia in that and our government's relationship with the Saudi Arabian regime to slip from people's minds. So I think as activists, as people who are particularly interested in these issues, it's our duty to push them within our movements, but also in the wider public to ensure that pressure on the British government is sustained and doesn't just increase when these conflicts end up on our TV screens for short periods.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to just quickly ask that same question to Paul, who has done a lot of work on this issue as well. But what other actions can individuals take to put pressure on governments around the world to stop selling death in the Middle East and elsewhere? You're muted, Paul, so you just have to unmute yourself first.
Apologies, Genevieve. I would list three things, certainly. One, the starting point always, knowledge is power. Get yourself really well informed. Andrew's book, The Shadow World, is a really good introduction. In Britain, the campaign against the arms trade has really good material available, and there are similar people in other countries. Get yourself well informed. The second issue, without doubt, is to look at all the different options open to you as an individual. In a field like this, it is very easy to feel you're isolated. But you're actually part of something much wider. And take a lead from what Richard was saying on the political side. But if you have the knowledge and the confidence yourself, you can convince more people, your friends and others, of the rightness of your case. And the third issue, without doubt, is this is part of something much wider. And this is why the contributions from Bianca, from Andrew and others on the nature of the whole military-industrial complex are so important. We have to accept that essentially we're dealing with something very big, very powerful, and it is so easy for these groups to provide themselves with new enemies. You're seeing that almost every day in the elevation of China and Russia to be the enemies that had to be faced. So those are three areas which I think are hugely valuable for everybody.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much to all of our honorable speakers. I now have the great honor and privilege to introduce Jeremy Corbyn, the founder of the Peace and Justice Project, who will close our conference and suggest conclusions and actions for future involvement and engagement. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Genevieve, and thank you to all our speakers. This has been an absolutely brilliant conference, and it's not the last time we're going to be meeting to discuss these issues, but each time we'll be better informed and better able to take the campaign forward by uniting all those groups that are essentially working in the same direction. I want to say a big thank you to you, Genevieve, and to Laura for putting this together and all the huge amount of work you've done over the last few weeks in getting this ready, and all the others that have helped to do this. A global conference on the arms trade with an incredible range of speakers who are so passionate, so well informed, and so brilliant. So thank you to everybody for the time and effort you put into achieving this today. There have to be a search for solutions about this. The problems of interconnecting companies that sell to each other, that set up joint enterprises with each other to get very big arms contracts. And bear in mind the points that Andrew made about one of the very biggest arms contracts that Britain ever got involved with was the Al Yamani one with Saudi Arabia, and all of the corruption that went with that. The other factor, which is an unpalatable one for legislators to look at all around the world, is that without public expenditure on research, on purchasing, on assisting on sales, the arms trade simply would not exist around the world. It is essentially a publicly funded trade. That's not obvious when you look at what goes on at arms fairs. It's not obvious when you look at the issues of the effects of arms sales. But somewhere along the line, there's a great deal of public money that goes into it. And for anyone that says, well, the arms trade is essentially benign, it's just selling arms for defense, not for internal repression, I ask them to look at the situation in Egypt at the present time, the corruption that has gone with the deals, the numbers of people that have lost their lives as a result of those arms deals, as a result of those arms being used. Look at the horrendous loss of life in Yemen that has happened by systematically selling arms to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, mainly by Britain and America, but other countries as well, and the huge destruction of Yemen as a result of it. We haven't said too much about the less well-known arms sales, but the supply of relatively unsophisticated weapons, small arms sales, small surveillance systems, armored cars, and all the other things that do turn up in conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, and in many other countries around the world. And so you have to ask yourself the question, what is going to happen next? Well, the arms industry is growing. It's selling more. The buildup of tensions between NATO and Russia on the borders of Russia and the Ukraine, the buildup of tensions between China and India on the northern border of India, but also in the South China Sea, and the alliance of India, Britain, Australia, and the United States that's building up an armed presence there, which of course will lead to a Chinese response of a bigger buildup, and it will lead to pressure from the arms industry in the West alongside the arms industry in China, making the same demands and the same pressures, because that is how it works. And so when people say, well, you know, these things are all inevitable and we've got to deal with the effects of it. Well, I've raised this question, as Richard has in the British Parliament, about our arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the effect in Yemen. And response I get from the British government is it's all within international law. It's all been properly sanctioned. And by the way, we're spending a great deal of money on supporting the redevelopment of Yemen. Well, we are subsidizing the destruction of Yemen and then patting ourselves on the back for giving money to Yemen in order to provide replacement water supplies, housing, schools, hospitals, and all the other things that are being destroyed in the war in the first place. And so it has to be a series of demands that we make, one of which is the operation of arms control systems, which are supposed to operate in the British Parliament as a quadripartite committee of a number of select committees to try and ensure that arms sales are at least restricted in some way. And we then have to raise the question of the most recent attacks on the people of Palestine and the arms sales that went with it from Britain and the United States to Israel that were used to bomb civilians in Palestine. And so the effects are well known. And then the political argument comes back, and I'm sure colleagues on this call, I'm sure Andrew would have faced them, I have faced them, colleagues in Canada would have faced them. Well, a lot of people work in the arms industry. True. There are amazing skills there as well, but it is not the job creator that it often claims to be. It is often highly sophisticated, but highly limited in what it does. And so I think we have to start developing the alternatives, an arms conversion system that puts those amazing skills to the civilian uses they could be put to. Think of the dangerous vessels that are ferries around the world, where many ferry disasters take place. Think of the health needs around the world that could be dealt with. Think of the transport needs that are around the world. Think of the housing needs. Think of so many of the needs of the poorest people in the poorest places that can be helped by a proper investment in something good for the future. So I conclude with this thought. We founded this project for peace and justice to bring people together, to challenge war, to challenge poverty, to challenge injustice around the world. And that's why we've had this conference today. But it only works if we seriously campaign within our own communities and our own societies to bring about real change in this world. We will show the video of this on our website, and it'll be there for all to see, and they can replay it because there's so much great information there. And we will continue sharing that information. And then we'll come back to it to get a report back of what we're all doing in our own societies to campaign for change, to campaign for that peaceful and just world that we want to achieve. There's no point complaining about the effects of war, of human rights abuses, of children dying of cholera in Yemen, or people's homes being destroyed in various places around the world, if we don't do something to stop the sale of arms that is being used to destroy those people's lives. We have a responsibility on all of us to do everything we can to bring about that more peaceful and more just world. That is what we've done this afternoon, and what we all do, all of us on this call, every day in our lives. Let's make sure there's even more of us doing it. Thank you very much indeed for coming today and for this event.
Thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in from around the world, and thanks again to our honorable speakers. If you would like to make a contribution to the Peace and Justice Project, I just signed up as a monthly sustainer for £20 a month, and I challenge 5 other people tuning into this conference to join me as a monthly sustainer. You can do that by going to thecorbynproject.com/donate. You can also get involved with future projects being put on by the Corbyn Project by going to thecorbynproject.com/action. And all of the links and all of the resources that we've shared today at this conference will be made available later on the Peace and Justice website. And you can also check out the Egypt Watch, who is a co-sponsor of this event, by going to egyptwatch.net. And all of the information of our honorable speakers will be available that way as well. So please check out those links. And thank you so much to everyone around the world for tuning in and for our speakers who have made this event possible. So thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.